Namaste and welcome to the Bharatvaarta podcast. I'm Roshan Karyappa. Today, Rajiv and I are privileged to host Sri Jayant Sinha ji, who, as you all know, is a member of Parliament and chairperson of Parliamentary Standing Committee on Finance. There are, of course, many fascinating aspects of Jayant ji's career that one can delve into. He's a multifaceted personality. He's been a successful investor, management consultant, and a politician. But today we'll be speaking very specifically about an important bill that Jayant has proposed to reduce India's net carbon emissions to zero by 2050. Namaste, sir. Thank you so much for being on the podcast.
Thank you very much for having me.
It's a pleasure to be able to host you. So, to begin with, before we speak about the bill itself, could you give us some background leading to it, sir? We're seeing, more and more frequent extreme weather events every year. Could you tell us the importance of switching to this net zero emissions model?
Yes, let me explain how dire the planetary emergency is right now. And we have obviously gone through a planetary emergency over the last year and a half, which is the COVID pandemic. And you have seen how that has impacted not just India, but every country around the world. And we are still struggling with that. Now, the risks and challenges that we are facing with climate change are actually an order of magnitude even more dire, even more serious than what we have experienced through the pandemic. So this is very, very serious. This is very important. And this is something that we will have to deal with, whether we like it or not, starting just about now, because you've already seen the number of extreme weather events that are happening, the warming that has already happened as far as the planet is concerned. And we are going to have to deal with it over the next few decades. Let me just give you some facts as to why that is the case. Today, the number of carbon parts per million in the atmosphere is already 440. With 440 parts per million, which is well above where we were in pre-industrial era, which was about 100 parts per million, we have about 1.5 degrees of global warming, average temperature, that's already locked in. So that's definitely going to happen, and the changes we are seeing in the climate are bound to happen. Now, what all serious climate scientists agree is that we have to restrict further warming to 1.5 degrees centigrade. So essentially, since about 1850 till about now, the Earth on average has already warmed by 1 degree centigrade. And so the effects that we are seeing of climate change right now are based on 1 degree increase in temperature. We have to restrict the incremental increase in temperature to no more than another 0.5 degrees, so that in total, we have global warming of only 1.5 degrees centigrade. Unfortunately, right now, with 440 parts per million of carbon in the atmosphere and the rate at which we are emitting carbon, we are on a trajectory where we are not going to be able to restrict global warming to 1.5 degrees centigrade, but it's going to go to 3 degrees centigrade. I will repeat. When I said it's a serious planetary emergency, I meant it. We are already on track right now to have heated up the world by 1.2 degrees centigrade. That is already locked and loaded. The trajectory we are on right now is going to result in 3 degrees centigrade of global warming, another 1.8 degrees. We absolutely have to keep it at 1.5 degrees centigrade, no more than that. Because the view is that between 1.5 and 2 degrees centigrade, there are a lot of things that will begin to happen that will tip the climate over in a direction that we will not be able to control. And I'll give you an example of that, which is that the Arctic and the Antarctic will begin to truly melt. During the warm period, which was millions and millions of years ago, we had crocodiles in the Arctic and the Antarctic. That's how warm it was. Crocodiles, right? Now, we are now in a situation where if we go to 3 degrees centigrade and we exceed the 1.5, 2 degree threshold that people are talking about, we're going to melt the Arctic, we're going to melt the Antarctic, sea levels are going to rise, many cities are going to get inundated, we will have storm surges that are going to swarm cities like Mumbai. So it can be a very disastrous situation if we don't restrict global warming to 1.5 degrees centigrade. Now, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has said that we have to get to net zero by 2050. That means no carbon emissions net by 2050 if we have to restrict it to 1.5 degrees centigrade. That's what the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has told us. That means everybody has to go to zero, not just India, but every country in the world has to go to zero. Now, to give you a sense of how difficult it is, total carbon dioxide equivalents of greenhouse gases right now is 55 billion tons. As I said, we have to restrict global warming to 1.5 degrees centigrade. If we keep emitting 55 billion tons, we will go to 3 degrees centigrade and we will irreversibly end up in a catastrophic situation. So we have to go from 55 billion tons to zero, which is what most climate scientists say. If we can get to 3, 4, 5 billion tons, that's perhaps okay. But really, we should be striving for zero by 2050. Okay? We are emitting 55 billion tons right now. Now, 130 countries have said that they are going to go to net zero by 2050. The European Union has said it. The US has said it's going to halve emissions by 2030, which means it's going to be on track to get to net zero by 2050. China has declared that it will be peaking in the next 1 or 2 or 3 years, and then will be going down to zero by 2060. So the two largest emitters, which are China and the US, have already said that they're going to go to net zero. The third emitter, which would be the European Union, has also agreed to go down to zero. Now, where is India? As I said, again, we have to restrict it to 1.5 degrees centigrade, which means you have to go from 55 billion tons to zero. Where is India? India is today emitting 3.5 billion tons of carbon dioxide equivalents. As I said, the global number is 55 billion tons, of which India is 3.5 billion tons. On the trajectory that we are on right now, and by the way, we are meeting all of our international commitments. We are well ahead of the national commitments that we made as part of the Paris Agreement, well ahead of it. Despite that, if our GDP continues to grow on average at 6% over the next few decades, which is what we are aspiring to, we are going to go from 3.5 billion tons to somewhere between 8 to 10 billion tons. Now, we are saying the world has to go to zero to restrict global warming to 1.5 degrees centigrade. How is the world going to get to zero if India is headed to 8 to 10 billion tons? And this 8 to 10 billion tons, as I said, is with us overachieving our Paris commitments. So we're doing a fantastic job. We're doing what we should. But we will be at 8 to 10 billion tons. How can the world get to zero if India is at 8 to 10 billion tons? So this is the dilemma that we as a country are facing and the planet is facing. The consequences are very, very serious and catastrophic. I'll stop here.
So that's a great segue to discuss on per capita emissions from India. And as we all know, India's contribution to per capita global emissions is still quite low. But as you were pointing out, sir, that as we grow the economy and we are aspiring to faster growth, higher sort of GDP level by the late 2020s, early 2030s. In fact, the stated target is to break the kind of a 5 trillion GDP mark. And as we go on that path, the absolute emissions come into the picture. And then, as you were saying, we have this dilemma of wanting to cut emissions, but at the same time, being a responsible sort of global player and squaring that with, India's own growth requirements, India's own kind of prosperity sort of aspirations and so on. So how do we square this, and what is the solution to this kind of dilemma that we are in?
Well, I just wanted to, Rajiv, I was just looking for the exact numbers so that you will see where we are in terms of GDP, tons per capita, right? I was just looking for those numbers, I found those. So India today is at 2.5 tons per capita. So if you look at it on a climate equity basis, India is at 2.5 tons per capita. The US is at 15 tons per capita. Okay, Japan is at 10 tons and China is at 7 tons. So if you look at it in terms of climate equity, We are at 2.5 tons. Now, if everybody has an equal right to pollute, of course, which they do, then maybe we should go to 15 tons per capita, right? Even if we follow through on our Paris commitments, we are going to get to somewhere in the range of about 5 tons per capita, right? 3.5 to 8 billion tons and so on. With some population growth, we're going to go to 5 tons per capita. Now, 5 tons per capita is well below where China is today at 7, well below where Japan is at 10, far below where the US is at 15, right? So therefore, if you look at it in terms of climate justice and climate equity, we have a right to put carbon in the environment, and we have a right to use carbon space as well. There's no question about it. And in fact, all the challenges that we're dealing with as far as climate change is concerned are challenges because richer countries, more advanced countries have put more carbon into the atmosphere. So this is not a question of justice or equity. We are the victims here. We are the victims. There's no question about it. And so our position has always been polluter pays. Those who have polluted the environment should pay, right? Which is absolutely correct. However, there is an interesting twist here. The interesting twist is that because so much research and so much investment has gone into green technologies, technologies that decarbonize, what has actually happened is that renewables have become cheaper than fossil-based electricity generations, which is solar and wind in some ways, is cheaper than coal.
Right.
Electric vehicles, total cost of ownership, is now cheaper than internal combustion engine vehicles. So now, instead of the discussion being about justice, the discussion has flipped over to competitiveness. And therefore, what I am suggesting is that we should also start to think differently and take advantage of what the world wants. The world wants to decarbonize. So therefore, what we should say is, let's commit to a net zero target. And once we commit to a net zero target and put together the policies and the incentives to support that, I think we're going to see hundreds of billions of dollars worth of investments coming into India, investing in more efficient green technologies, which will also make us much, much more competitive. And that's why I say what India needs to do, and this should be our entire development model, in fact. I'm arguing that this should be a development model, is to get to the green frontier, right? And just like digitization and globalization has driven the Indian economy since liberalization over the last 30 years, I think green should drive the Indian economy over the next 30 years. So this year, as you know, we've celebrated 30 years of reforms. So let the next 30 years till 2050 be about greening the Indian economy. Now,
this week, in fact, actually. This week, in fact.
Yes, exactly. July 19th, I think it was.
Yeah.
So, the benefit of greening the Indian economy is that not only are we then investing in green technologies that are more cost effective than the brown technologies that we have right now, it also means hundreds of billions of dollars of investment goes into our economy, which naturally creates jobs and drives growth, right? And enables us to be able to put in place the most sophisticated advanced technologies that the world is investing in. And the world will invest in that because the world knows it's in their self-interest. The other very important, so I call it a triple win. And let me tell you why. One, it drives competitiveness. Two, as I've said, it decarbonizes and greens our economy. And third, it's tremendously good for the quality of our air and deals with the pollution problems we're dealing with in our cities. So some of the modeling we're doing is showing us that we're going to save lakhs of lives because we're going to bring down air pollution. So it's a win-win-win. More competitive economy, lower carbon emissions, and at the same time, cleaner air. So I think it's terrific. And therefore, my slogan now is net zero is net positive. Net zero is net positive. By committing to a net zero target and not using the carbon space, which is our right, we are actually making our economy more competitive. We're decarbonizing our economy and making our country much, much cleaner as well. And that's what I call getting to the green frontier. It's at the frontier because it's at the competitive frontier, and it's green because it uses zero carbon, and it cleans up our air. I think this is a historic opportunity. This is the opportunity of our lifetime. And for those of us who are investors like Rajiv, I think this is going to be the biggest investment opportunity we are ever going to see. And I think that is the spirit that we have to have, which is let's invest in greening our economy, creating jobs, decarbonizing, and creating a cleaner, better future for all of us.
That's
Wonderful.
really eloquently put, and I have to say I largely agree.
So Rajiv's a very tough critic. So I'm very glad I've been able to persuade him.
Right. I want to talk about, follow up on what you mentioned, which is, having both the high competitiveness and productivity along with the long-term sustainability and being resource efficient. The Prime Minister often talks about Bharat being a Vishwaguru, right, for the world. So, could you elaborate on what precedent this would set for, future regulators and also others who are looking at us keenly, others in the world?
No, I completely agree. And I think the Honorable Prime Minister is exactly right to talk about Atmanirbhar Bharat. And my equation is that A and B equals CSR, right? A and B equals CSR. Atmanirbhar Bharat equals a competitive Bharat on the green frontier, a sustainable Bharat on the green frontier, and a resilient Bharat on the green frontier, so that our health outcomes are also improved and we can invest and build up a healthy economy as well. So that's why I think, for us to pursue Atmanirbharta, competitiveness is key, sustainability is key, and those are the things that we can really strive for when we get to the green frontier. And please remember that these green technologies actually create far more jobs than the brown technologies do, right? There are many more people involved in doing solar than they are in running a thermal power plant. We have to build an entirely new infrastructure for electric charging. That's going to use a lot of people, right? So all of that, the investment that's going to flow into green our economy is going to create jobs. And by the way, one of the things I've been doing is, because my intuition has always been that if you pour hundreds of billions of dollars of investment into the Indian economy, it's bound to grow. I mean, that's just pure, simple economic logic, right? But what I have also now started to do is to work with a series of modeling groups, some of the best systems dynamics and econometric modelers in the world. And I have asked them to actually do these very deep analytical studies to see whether my intuition is right, whether net zero is actually pro-growth or not. And guess what? The early results coming back from these modeling studies is that relative to a baseline, net zero is net positive. Net zero is net positive. And the conventional view is that net zero is net negative, because if you don't give us cheap fossil fuels, we will not be able to grow quickly. But we know that that's a fallacy. We know that those fossil fuels are not cheap. First of all, they're expensive. If you price in the negative externalities associated with coal and so on, they're actually quite expensive. But here's the best part. Solar, wind, electric mobility are even cheaper. And that's because all of this research, all of this investment is going into these green technologies. And so we have an opportunity to leapfrog the brown economy, go straight to the green economy. And I think that's really what's going to drive growth for India going forward.
So you've said, I think earlier, that committing to a legally binding net zero target would help India attract trillions of dollars in investment that will be required for the green transformation. So on this sort of financial aspect, can you elucidate that a little bit more? Because how would India sort of attract that capital? And relatedly, I would also add to this point. There are some critics who say that even the sort of clean tech or green tech kind of companies rely on extractive industries, right? In the area of minerals and in the area of metals. For example, electric vehicles require certain types of metals like cobalt and other kind of minerals to build out those engines and batteries and components and so on. So on both these aspects, actually, that attracting capital as well as that aspect of the extractive industry involved in the green economy.
Yeah.
If you can comment on that.
I think a legally binding target, Rajiv, is very important. Because if investors have to commit hundreds of billions of dollars, they need to have conviction and the predictability that goes with the government committing to the target. So the government says, I'm committed, I'm going to do it. Everybody knows that that is the way we are now trying to move the economy forward. So then, of course, we will make the necessary shifts when it comes to power generation. We will put in place the right standards when it comes to electric mobility. We will put in place the right standards when it comes to buildings, to energy efficient appliances, to cement, steel, all of those different things, right? So they know that this is the policy framework that the government is following. Now, if we are not crystal clear about it, investors will see it as being a much more riskier investment. And we know very clearly from CAPM that the higher the risk, the higher the expected return has to be, right? So if we are not clear about our policy position, investors will naturally say, rather than investing at a hurdle rate of 8 or 9 or 10% in dollar terms, they'll say, I want to invest only at 14 or 15% in dollar terms. So therefore, by providing policy predictability, making our policy regime crystal clear to everyone, we will reduce the risk for investors. And so we will get capital at a lower cost, and we'll be able to invest more and drive the economy further, right? So policy and predictability has a real cost attached to it. And that is the risks that you create for investors. And that's why I'm saying, let's have a legally binding target, so that sense of uncertainty about what the government really wants to do, and whether it's this government or the next government or the next government. Remember, this is 30 years we are talking about. We're talking about very long-lived assets that people have to invest in. They need to know that this is the way the government and every other government is going to go. So that it becomes very, very important. The legally binding target is extremely important. Now, let me come to the second question that Rajiv had, which is how much actually are electric vehicles saving us and solar saving us? And that's for climate scientists to figure out. The reality, of course, is that yes, we will be putting some carbon into the atmosphere, even when we are using solar, even when we're using electric vehicles. So we'll figure out how much. But it is maybe 5 or 10% of what we would be doing if we were using coal or fossil fuels. And the idea of net zero, not zero, zero, but net zero, is that even as we do actually emit some carbon, we will have carbon sinks as well, whether it's reforestation, whether it's carbon capture, carbon sequestration. There are various technologies that people are thinking about to actually be able to take some of this carbon and capture it. Now, there are many very interesting aspects to it. For example, you can take carbon, put it into cement, and make cement better as a result of that. So I think we'll be exploring all those different carbon sinks and carbon capture mechanisms. And I think that will enable us to actually get to a net zero target, even as there is some positive carbon emission from some of these technologies, as Rajiv is correctly pointing out.
Right. So you recently inaugurated India's first Just Energy Transition Center. And since the 2015 Paris Agreement, it's something that has been gaining momentum. If you could elaborate a little more on, what are the benefits from having this, from this transition to Just Energy?
Just transition is very, very crucial for India. We have crores of people today that are, deriving their livelihoods from fossil fuels of one kind or another. I myself come from Hazaribagh, which is one of the largest coal producing districts in India. And I can tell you, we have lakhs of people that are dependent on the coal economy. So a just transition is going to be one in which people who are working on fossil fuels are able to find better livelihoods working on green technologies. So we have to manage that very carefully, because across India, there are probably crores of people that are either directly, indirectly, or in induced employment from fossil fuels. And the only way we can do that is by first mapping it out and understanding what the dependency and the risks really are. And then putting in place the livelihood creation and the job creation programs and the hand-holding that's necessary to move people from one set of technologies to the other. The good news, of course, is that through retirement, a lot of people are going to be coming out of fossil fuels in any case. So, for example, in Coal India, because of retirements, I think employment has shrunk from about 6.5 lakhs to 2.5 lakhs right now. That's already happened. And over time, as more retirements happen, again, the workforce will continue to dwindle. So there are ways which we can do it. The good news is that we have time. We have 30 years, 40 years to be able to do this. The important thing is we've got to start planning for it now and dealing with it so that we in fact do have this just transition and we can make sure people have better lives as we go through this transition.
So link to that actually was going to be my next question on, completely phasing out coal over the coming decades. So obviously, as we all know, India is a very coal-rich country, very large kind of untapped reserves that we have of coal. And there's the question of those who work in the coal economy, as you were mentioning, as well as, if we don't use coal, supplementing all of that kind of capacity, potential capacity with renewables. So again, a slightly two-part question was, how do we handle this transition if we are to sort of shift away from coal? And additionally, what role can nuclear energy play in the overall green transition? Because as we know, nuclear is a good sort of baseload technology for generating power. And while it has been controversial in recent years because of the perceived safety issues, but how do you see nuclear in India's context, and whether we should be adopting that, not adopting that, and so on?
So Rajiv, you largely answered the question you posed. We use about 1 billion tons a year of coal, 1 billion tons a year, of which about 70% goes into thermal power generation. That's where we are right now. And I believe the numbers are about 350 to 400 gigawatts of energy at peak is roughly what we're using right now. So what we need to be able to do is we need to be able to build up our renewables, which of course we are already doing. The Honorable Prime Minister has committed to 450 gigawatts of renewables by 2030. So we are already moving in that direction. And as we continue to progress in that direction, we will be able to, through battery storage, through dealing with issues of intermittency and building a grid, etc., be able to come to a point where the vast majority of our electricity needs are, provided for by renewables because of everything that's happening, and many countries are moving in that direction. Now, as Rajiv correctly points out, one crucial element of that energy transition, power in terms of power generation, is going to be nuclear. Nuclear, we all know, is a very good supplier of baseload electricity. And the latest nuclear technologies are much safer and even more cost effective. And so with the judicious usage of these kinds of nuclear technologies, we, I think, will be able to supply all of the electricity that we need through a combination of renewables and nuclear. I think all the modeling is showing that that is entirely feasible. And if we plan for it carefully over the next 30, 40 years, we'll certainly be able to get there and be able to use a lot more electricity. Because remember, once we replace fossil fuels on the electric mobility side, we will be electrifying the economy in a much more intense way. We'll be using electricity a lot more, which means our consumption of electricity is going to go up dramatically. And that's why we need both solar, and we need nuclear, and we need offshore wind, and perhaps we'll need some more hydro as well. But the good news is that if you look at these different sources, there's more than enough supply available for us to be able to get to a much larger electricity generation system, while at the same time transitioning away from fossil fuels. So it's entirely feasible. And I think, again, it requires thoughtful planning and thoughtful work, but it's entirely necessary and entirely feasible.
Right. Yeah. So I had a question on renewables, but I think you've covered that. It's especially heartening to note that over the last 6-7 years, we've increased our commitment and capacity tremendously. I think the Prime Minister recently mentioned that we've increased our capacity by 250% in that time frame of the last 6-7 years. Rajiv, do you want to focus on EV specifically, since that's a pet topic for you?
Yeah, so with electric vehicles sort of really coming into the, I would say, mainstream of discussion now, from being on the kind of edges of discourse just a few years ago. Where do you see EVs sort of in the overall landscape of the green transformation, and particularly given where the fuel prices are, there's a lot of angst also, right, with consumers. That
Rajiv, I think we are going to become the EV capital of the world, in my view. And that's because we are the world's leader in two-wheelers. We, sell about 20 million units a year of two-wheelers, right? And if you see, how quickly electric two-wheelers are starting to get developed, whether it is as scooters or as motorcycles, you can see the Ola factory that's being built in Tamil Nadu for 1 million units a year. Very, very quickly, we'll turn the stock over and we will be starting to make the largest number of electric two-wheelers in the world. And we will be doing it at a price point which no other country in the world will be able to match. We can become a very big exporter of electric two-wheelers, and I've been saying this for many, many years now. And I'm very glad to see that that's taking off with the kinds of companies that we have, such as Ola, Ether, Hero Electric, and so on. So that's a fantastic thing. We'll become, the world's hub when it comes to electric two-wheelers. At the same time, for small cars, which are ideally suited for being electric, already we are the world's largest manufacturer of smaller cars. I think those also we will flip over pretty quickly. Of course, we need batteries for that, and I think Reliance and other companies are going to build massive gigafactories for batteries as well. And that is going to propel us to be the largest manufacturer of smaller four-wheelers and smaller passenger cars as well. And smaller trucks also, like the 1-ton trucks that we see all over our cities as well. So when you look at the volumes, whether it's two-wheelers, whether it is passenger cars, or whether it's smaller commercial vehicles, we will be producing the largest volume of electric vehicles in the world. And that's why I said we'll be the electric vehicle capital of the world. And that's fantastic for our country because, it's obviously a very labor-intensive manufacturing process, and it will enable us to become, a very large automotive producer. And that's why I say, we will be getting to the green frontier. We'll be the most competitive producer of high-volume electric vehicles in the world, and that's a fantastic opportunity for us.
Yeah, absolutely. I think EV is where consumer internet was about 15, 20 years back, I feel. If you look at the startup innovation that's happening, it's a little early in the curve. So people are having to build out, full stack capabilities, batteries, charging stations, and plenty of other things. But I think it'll get, easier for people to sort of ship in this space, in the next 5, 10 years, maybe. So,
not
sir,
even
this has been a
critically, actually, Roshan. So I'm tempted to sort of also ask about what we are seeing in ethanol blending. So there's been a very important push in that area by the government too. Trying to bring sustainability to the sugar sector, where there's been a history of like booms and busts in sugar prices, and with blending, there is a big opportunity for sugar mills to actually get more stability. And obviously connected to that is a very large base of sugarcane farmers in northern and western India.
No, Rajiv, you're exactly right again. And again, blended fuels, biofuels of various kinds, are also a great opportunity for our agricultural sector, and particularly for long distance transport for our commercial vehicles and so on. It's a
even flights.
And
sir, we had even seen that flight, that incredible sort of example of aviation fuel, right? So with that, I think it was a Dehradun Delhi flight a couple of years ago.
Yeah, and of course, I was one of the people who inaugurated.
Yes.
So I think absolutely biofuels are part of the future as well. And again, all of these will evolve if we set the right sort of standards, and if we really define our policy framework and say we want to go to net zero. I think a lot of these technologies will start to emerge, and the investment will flow in. And of course, again, remember that biofuels are wonderful in terms of job creation as well. And just think about the impact on our balance of payments. Today, we are importing $125 billion, $125 billion of fossil fuels, oil, for petrol and diesel. Now, if we can replace that with electricity that we're generating here through solar and offshore wind and through biofuels, that $125 billion is going to stay right here in India. Think about that impact in terms of what it will do for our economy.
Right. Yeah, so this has been a fascinating experience, because often times, I mean, we hear this false dichotomy of growth and sustainability. But what you have argued very eloquently over the course of this podcast is that actually demand and innovation will fuel sustainability, right? So just to close the loop on that, sir, finally, how do you see India's position in terms of clean energy maybe 10 years from now? We'd love to end on an optimistic note.
We are going to be global leaders. There's no question about it. As I said, we will be world leaders when it comes to electric vehicles because we'll have the highest volumes anywhere in the world. If you look at what people are planning in terms of batteries, for example, Reliance's announcements, we will be world leaders when it comes to batteries. We are already among the largest generators of solar and wind power, and that is going to continue to increase. And of course, even solar panels, we are going to become a world leader in the manufacturing of that. There's hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars of investment that's ready to come into India. And all we have to do is commit ourselves to this net zero pathway. And as I said, this net zero pathway leads us to the green frontier. It leads us to a competitive, sustainable, resilient, healthy economy, which is win-win-win on all counts. And I think that really is the development pathway that we should be on.
Right. Fantastic. That's a great note to end the podcast on. Thank you so much for being so gracious with your time, sir. And thank you, Rajiv, for co-hosting this with me.
You're very welcome.
Thank you, Roshan, for inviting me. And thank you, Jayant, for your time.
Sorry, as I was saying, to conclude, net zero is
positive. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for tuning in to this episode of the Bharatvaarta podcast. If you want to see more content like this, then don't forget to subscribe to our channel. We started Bharatvaarta to facilitate long-form discussions on politics, policy, and culture. We don't necessarily endorse anything that was said in this episode. If you wish to offer us feedback, do reach out to us on social media. We are at Bharatvaarta on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. You could also get in touch with us on our website, www.bharatvaarta.in. The links are in the description below. Until next time, stay safe, take care, and Jai Hind.